Welcome to the Hearth Matters podcast with me, Catherine Lucas Damer, and my co host, Aaron Zuma. Today, we are delighted to welcome Malcolm and Simone Collins, the brilliant and accomplished co founders of Pronatalist.org. What a dynamic duo! They bring a unique blend of data driven analysis along with a passionate enthusiasm to a really difficult subject, declining fertility rates and global demographic collapse. But they're not here to tell you to have more babies, although you probably should. The goal of pronatalism is the preservation of a pluralistic and diverse human species. And you'll hear a lot more about what they mean by that in our conversation. And while their nonprofit is focused on raising awareness about global demographic collapse, they're also developing a variety of useful and pragmatic resources. In fact, they've written a series of pragmatist guides on everything from education, relationships, and sexuality to religion and governance. And they offer a number of other resources on their website, including a well researched Google Doc that rates states according to their family friendliness. And Simone has curated a really fun playlist of vintage guides to life that Aaron and I found particularly amusing. These two are prolific innovators, and we loved our conversation with them, even if we were a little nervous. This was our first time in the interviewer's seat, so not only did we learn a lot from Malcolm and Simone, we also learned a thing or two about podcasting. So buckle up. This is a fast-paced and provocative conversation that we hope you'll find as interesting and educational as we did. What is pronatalism and what are the goals of your organization?
So the core goal of our organization, a lot of people think it's to get fertility rates up. No, it's just to get people to, at a base level, recognize how big the problem is, and the effects the problem is going to have, and to begin to plan around those effects. As we say, anyone who's familiar with the statistics and what's been tried already and what works and doesn't work, um, if we are on the Titanic, we are not trying to avoid the iceberg anymore. We are trying to prep the lifeboats. We are going to hit the population iceberg no matter what at this rate. For example, right now in the US, if our fertility rate keeps declining at the same rate it has over the last 10 years, over the next, century, and we see one generation every 30 years, for every 100 Americans, there's going to be 4.3 great grandchildren. We are looking at really deep fertility decline. It's in for a lot of countries around the world, we're talking double-digit yearly declines, which
Mhm.
is you don't see like people who are familiar with like watching statistics. Double-digit yearly declines are horrifying when you're looking at something that is like this key to whether it's our social systems, or the economy, or just the future of what it means to be human. So we're not about increasing the number of people in the world. In the same way that
Mm.
like a lot of people, if they heard an early global warming organization and they'd never heard of global warming before, and they're like, "What? So it's your goal to freeze the planet to make the planet colder every year?" And it's like, no, we're just pointing out that there are troubling statistics that we should be taking in mind and working to address in some ways.
Yeah, we're curious about the movement, but also about, I think before even the movement and its composition, what are some of these consequences that you're warning people about, or advising people on, hey, it's time to prepare and shore up your resources if you are going to, if you're my age, or if you're that 22-year-old, or if you're our children, right? Like, you are directly impacted by falling
Right.
birth rates, but what does that mean to that individual?
I mean, I think to a lot of your audience, which, is largely female and to a certain extent, a little bit progressive leaning, this is dire because the future of feminism relies on people who hold feminist views, who support reproductive rights, who support the right to not have children, to be child free
Mhm.
if you want to be, to never get married if you never want to get married, to have unconventional relationships. All of that depends on people who support those values having kids, and people who support those at least now, they're not having kids. So in terms of preparing for the future, a lot of that's, well, okay, if you want your great grandchildren to have these rights, are you going to be able to build a cultural enclave or join a community that you think in several generations and 200, 300 years will continue to be able to protect these things. Because in China, in 200 to 300 years, I don't know. I mean, even in 50 years, I mean, already in
This
China.
reminds me of one of my
Go
favorite
ahead.
quotes about us, where The Guardian was writing a piece on us. They've done a few pieces on us, and they quoted me, or it was Simone actually saying, look, if it turns out what we're seeing in China right now is the way that they are motivating higher fertility rates is by removing women's rights. If it turns out that that is the only way, the cultural groups and countries that remove women's rights, if those are the only ones that are able to motivate a stable fertility rate, that mindset is the mindset that will predominate the future of our species. That is how we get a Handmaid's Tale situation.
Right.
And they saw that, and their response was, "That sounds an awful lot like a threat to me." And we're like, "Are you a child?" Like, we're like, if you touch the stove, you burn your hand. If it turns out the only countries that still have kids are the ones that take away women's rights, who's going to be the future of humans? That's not like
Right.
a threat. That's just an axiomatic truth. It's something that I think for a lot of people, they're just struggling to accept because it goes against what they see as their team's goal.
Mm.
And they are so focused on their team's goal, they're not actually thinking about the long-term consequences of this wider societal game we're playing right now, which are going to be enormous. And we've also got to keep in mind, Simone bringing up the social side of this, but this is also going to affect people economically. We have
And by
lived
this,
in
we
a
should also
world-
say, like, a more common term that's used to refer to this problem, as Malcolm describes it, is demographic collapse, or population collapse. That is how you're going to see it described to the news increasingly as this becomes a bigger issue over time. Go on, Malcolm.
Yeah, well, so a lot of people, they're really only focused, when they think about this issue, they think of it in terms of Social Security. Right. And as people know, Social Security is like a literal pyramid scheme. Like, it is actually unfunded and funded by younger generations because when it was created, there was an assumption that the younger generations would always be larger than the older generations because the world was growing back then. And so they look at it and they are unaware of how severe things have gotten at this point. But when they begin to realize it, the first thing they're worried about is how are we going to pay Social Security? And so they begin to naively, they're like, well, in the developing world, the fertility rate's still high. It's just low in the developed world. This is wrong. Actually, as of back in 2019, collectively, and these are the UN's own stats, collectively, Central America, South America, and the Caribbean fell below repopulation rate. That means they are no longer repopulating themselves. India fell below repopulation rate last year. China, their fertility rate is falling double digits every year. Even a lot of countries, like, people have bad intuitions about what countries have low fertility rates. Like, for example, a country with a famously low fertility rate is Iran. Like, generally, when a country has above 5,000 USD per year per citizen in terms of GDP, they're going to be below replacement rate in the world today. So the only countries you really see above replacement rate are desperately, desperately poor countries, where starvation is a part of everyday life. And so for us, that's not where we get our immigrants from as a country. We get our immigrants from primarily Latin America, and we are a farmer that is draining a pond. And I point out to the farmer, that pond is evaporating. And they go, not my problem. It's not my pond. And I'm like, yeah, but you're using it to water your crops, you knob. And also, I mean, the whole situation is really kind of messed up if you think about it from a Social Security angle, where we as a country, because I then point this out to people, they're like, well, we can still get people from Africa. And I'm like, okay, so your plan, because Americans, white Americans didn't put in the work. And so now you have an unfunded Social Security program, is to import people from Africa and force them to pay for a bunch of non-working white people who didn't put in the effort to put in savings themselves. It's like, that sounds incredibly unethical to me. And honestly, pretty racist.
Or they have kids, right? We didn't have enough kids,
No,
ourselves.
put in effort
We
to
didn't
have
take in
kids.
we didn't take that responsibility on.
Yeah, we didn't take that responsibility, so we're using other people's children. And keep in mind, when we import immigrants, their fertility rate falls dramatically. The average first-generation immigrant fertility rate in the U.S. is only 1.7, like well below replacement rate. So
Yes.
we can't like bring an immigrant population over here and like think that they're going to stabilize our population. We need to keep predating on these populations. But it gets worse. So Social Security is like the fake goose that like you're worried about. The actual real situation here is our entire economic system was built on the assumption of constant growth. And we have had constant growth because the number of producers and the number of consumers throughout human history, all of human history, have been growing exponentially. Um, i.e., the number of people, the number of workers,
Mhm.
and the productivity per worker has been growing linearly. A lot of people assume because technology has grown exponentially, productivity per worker has grown exponentially, but that's just not true if you look at the statistics. For about the
Mm.
past 200 years, we've had a linear growth in productivity per worker. Well, if, and all the statistics say this is what we're going to see, we begin to see populations fall exponentially within economically productive countries. Well, what that means is we are going to enter a world, likely within our lifetimes and definitely within our kids' lifetimes, where the economy on average is shrinking every year. And this destroys the underpinnings of our economic system. Now, people who haven't invested, we've worked in private equity. Debt is a miraculous thing when things are growing. If I'm making an investment in something and $8 of that investment is debt and $2 of that investment is equity, and that investment grows just 20%, I've doubled my money, right? But if it shrinks by just 20%, I've lost all my money. Um,
Right.
and we as a society, because we had this constant growth, we decided to leverage, or which is a technical term for take out debt against every layer of our society, from our human capital, our college students, to our land, to our cities, to our states, to
Mm.
our nations, to our economic producers, our companies, everything. We basically maxed out leverage on all of civilization. This isn't an America, this isn't a West problem. China did the same thing, Japan did the same thing, Korea did the same thing. When the system begins shrinking on average, the whole thing will crumble. And I'm not saying have kids for economic reasons, but I'm saying by the time you understand the consequences that are going to result from the world collectively deciding that kids weren't worth the effort anymore, you are not going to live with the same opulence you have today. And you may not have the same opportunities you have today to protect what comes next. As I say, we're going to have to explain to our kids why, in the last age of opulence, before a dark age, we spent our time fooling around on TikTok and Twitter and YouTube instead of building the systems that make their lives iteratively more bearable in a world that has dramatically less than our world today. And keep in mind, when I say dramatically less, I don't mean like a lot of people think, oh, economically, this means it'll be like a developing country today, like, somewhere in South America or something, we'll have less, but whatever. No, when a developed country collapses, it is much worse to an economic level below what it had prepped for. It is much worse in a developing country at that same economic level.
Mm.
And a great example of a country where we're seeing this right now is South Africa. That's what we are likely to see in Europe and the United States. And by that, what I mean is rolling blackouts will be common. Wealthy people will begin to build basically fortified communities. And organized crime will become a shadow government existing alongside the normal governments that you're interacting with. This is not going to be, there's no like silver lining to this, except for one we'll get to later in the interview. But this silver lining only exists for the people who are having kids.
Mm.
Okay, got it.
So the
Well,
question is why, though? So
yeah.
why is it the case that increasing GDP result in falling birth rate?
Or gender equality. And I think you talk about on your website PGET, where these are the four, that's an acronym for four areas that seem to correlate to reduction
Yeah.
in
Prosperity, gender equality, education, and what was T? Technology?
Yeah,
Anyway, Simone.
technically.
kind of correlates with weird, right? White, educated,
Yeah, it's
industrialized,
very
rich.
similar.
Yeah.
It's to a certain extent, it's a little bit of a red herring because another big thing that has disappeared as we've learned all these things is culture. And
Yeah.
culture used to be something so powerful that, I mean, obviously women used to die at really high rates in childbirth. This was a deadly, terrifying thing to do. And yet women really wanted to be mothers. and they'd be
Mhm.
devastated if they couldn't be mothers, and they would try and try again, even if they had devastating losses. So why? Well, that's culture. They lived in a culture that idolized motherhood. They lived in a culture in a society that, believed that becoming a parent was important, raising kids was important, and that also had sustainable values around raising kids. We
Yeah.
don't. So what has happened at the same time that we've gained prosperity, technology, education, and gender equality is that we have also lost culture that motivates people to have kids, that celebrates people for becoming mothers, for becoming families, for having kids.
Yep.
We've also created the most unreasonable, insane standards for parenting that you could ever imagine. We're now raising children as though they are retired millionaires, chauffeuring them to their tennis lessons,
Oh, yes.
monitoring every moment of their day, waiting on them hand and foot, making sure there's no moment in which they're not entertained by us. This is not how even the wealthiest children were raised. Well, where were they? They were if they're in some grand palace or manor house, they're somewhere down in the kitchen. Their governess is chasing after them, maybe, but probably not. And maybe they're getting maybe 2 to 3 hours of synchronous instruction per day from, an expert tutor, probably a world-class one, but still, they're spending most of the day running around, probably not being that supervised. Unless you're Queen Victoria, but she was raised in a pretty toxic way and she hated that and resented it.
Right.
So,
Right,
a lot of that is what happened, and that's a lot of our focus because, a lot of people, we've become a lot more affluent. And yet the number one complaint that people give you, the thing they say when they don't want to have kids or when they try to explain why they can't have kids or they're waiting to have kids is, I just can't financially afford it. At this point, it's too expensive. And yes, and part of that's the societal standards we have, which are insane. But it's really not money. And we've seen this in governmental efforts to motivate women and families to have kids with money, with payments per month, per child, bonuses, all sorts of things. Basically, huge amounts of money only make tiny differences. And the amount of
Yeah.
money that you'd have to actually pay as a government to make a difference in birth rates for your nation is so high that you just can't afford it, which is why nations like China are switching over to things like removing vasectomy clinics, removing access to abortions, removing access to birth control, and who knows what they're going to do next. Because in the end, coercion seems to be probably one of the most feasible options.
If you look at the US, the less money you have, the more kids you have. If you look between countries, the less money they have, the more kids they have. Anyone who's saying, well, I can't afford it, what they really mean is I can't afford it without making sacrifices to my lifestyle.
Right.
Because they think that they should never have to make major sacrifices to their lifestyle. That is the way we raise kids these days. And so, of course, they're not having kids, right? But I think another thing that's really important to note is you noted that a lot of the things that have to do with falling fertility rate correlate with the weird acronym. The one that doesn't is white. White people actually have the highest resistance to prosperity-induced fertility collapse of any demographic.
Interesting.
The white people are going to disproportionately exist in the future. So people would be like, well, what about black people? Don't they have lots of kids? Black people only have lots of kids because they're disproportionately poor. When they get wealthy, they have fewer kids than white people have. And they're like, oh, okay. There's got to be some other Asians. The number one group affected by this is East Asians. You look at the fertility rate of a country like Korea, even if it doesn't continue to fall, for every 100 Koreans, there will be 6.4 great grandchildren at this point. And people are like, well, and this is the thing. A lot of people look at this and they're like, oh, the fertility rate's got to stop falling at some point. It's got to slow down at some point. And then you point out, you go, but we have countries that are further ahead on this timeline than us. We know where we're going to be in 20 years. That's where Korea is.
In Japan.
Korea spent $200 billion trying to fix this over the last 16 years, and they haven't. Okay. Year over year for Q3 this last year, Korea's fertility rate fell by 13%. And this is at their already desperately low level. Somebody's like, well, maybe they'll figure out something tomorrow that can fix it. Too late, bucko. 60% of Korea's population is over the age of 40 at this point. There is nothing they can do. We are looking at an entire culture and ethnic group going extinct before our eyes. In fact, if this was a species, if you saw the rates falling this quickly, they would be categorized as an endangered species. I
Yeah.
think even a critically endangered species,
Wow.
with fertility rates falling this quickly. And yet we just don't care because we have become a world that is, so long as the problem like isn't acutely a current problem in Africa, like if there is some Black population that's not subject to this problem, we just ignore it. And what we don't realize is that this entire situation enormously privileges white people. When I should say white people, I don't mean white urban people. I'm talking about the people who are resistant to this are conservative Christians and conservative Jews. Those are the two populations that are most resistant to this. So it's a very different cultural group than the people who are thinking. And these people think very, very differently about the world, about childbirth than these people who are living in cities, but they do have high fertility rates, often in spite of a lot of wealth.
So religion is, I guess, holding their culture together.
Yes.
And
Not well.
and
It
well,
depends on the religion. I mean, we can
but
go through the different religions if you want to.
well,
Catholicism, terrible, terrible. Their
Catholics over
fertility
here.
rate right now, the average Catholic right now, so the average Catholic majority country in Europe right now has a fertility rate of only 1.3.
right, that's
Uh,
Italy, right? Italy
Right.
is terrible fertility
yeah.
rate.
Oh, it's horrible. It's horrible. Orthodox Christianity pretty low. Right now, I think even worse than Catholicism. Evangelical Christians are okay. So like this is evangelical Protestantism is okay. Mormonism fell below repopulation rate, but it's still pretty strong. But I mean that's bad. I mean Mormons used to have like 6
Right.
kids. Now they
Yeah.
can't even maintain their population. The real goat of all this, like the one who's just cleaning up and running laps on everyone else is conservative Jews. But yeah, I mean it's not that every religion, but all of these groups are still doing better than groups like when Muslim groups gets wealthy, their fertility rate falls dramatically. Now, one of the problems that this causes is if you're talking about like how do I ensure that my group exists in the future, the dominant strategies are to, as a culture, undertake practices that lower the economic potential of your group or cause your group to disengage with technology. And then they prevent their group from outbreeding by increasing the amount of xenophobia within the group and increasing the amount that the groups like denigrate outsiders. What this means is that the future world that we're going to be in, a lot of the most successful population groups are going to be groups that are not economically productive, that are technophobic, and that hate everyone who doesn't think and look like them.
Oh,
That's going to be
interesting.
a much bigger problem in the future than it is today.
Uh-huh. Uh-huh.
So what about the pronatalist movement? Is that, do you find that it skews heavily religious, or what is kind of the
Yeah.
composition? Who's attracted to pronatalism?
Lot of so this is so we would say it's interesting. So there's sort of two sides to the prenatalist movement. When people are like, what we're doing now as a society doesn't work, one group says, well, then we need to go back to what we used to do, and then the other group says, well, then we need to figure out a new stable state. And these are sort of the two sides of the pronatalist movement. We are sort of seen as the leaders of the new stable state side of the movement. When we saw the first pronatalist conference, about 2/3 of the people who came were in this group. We call it the technophilic group. They include a lot of religious people, but they are often like religious in an odd way when you consider traditionalist religions. And then of the people who are like actively involved, about 1/3 are in the religious camp. However, if you look at like broad pronatalists, I'd actually say that probably 70% are in the religious camp. But most of the people in the religious camp identify more with their religious group than they do as a prenatalist movement more broadly. I.e., they're more interested in getting Catholic fertility rates up or getting Jewish fertility rates up than they are about like solving this problem as a whole. So they are just less engaged with like the overarching movement. But we have really good relations. Like if you look at our podcast listeners, I think a good 60% are in the religious camp. And it makes a lot of sense because they're the most resistant to this. And a big thing that we're seeing as a society is because this dominant cultural group, this what we call the urban monoculture, is so low in fertility rates, it can only maintain its population by taking children from high fertility cultural groups that exist around it.
Mhm.
And so it parasitizes these demographically healthy cultural groups. And this historically was, at least a symbiotic relationship, and that it was more economically productive and it was more technologically productive and it worked to sort of protect these groups and increase their affluence. Now the fertility rate has gotten so low within the urban monoculture, which is this far progressive group, which is dominant in all the cities in our society, that it has begun to sort of go crazy in the way it's trying to recruit kids. And It's creating a lot of conflict because it's no longer sustainably harvesting what it sees as its lessers. And so people are getting angry. And it's beginning to become an existential question for both groups. For the urban monoculture, if it can't take these children, then it stops existing. For these conservative traditions, they stop existing if they can't protect their children.
Hmm. Well, to add to all of this is that we're transitioning from the industrial era into a new information era. We have all kinds of new technology that we don't fully understand. It's almost impossible to predict the future in any sort of rational way because it's kind of like playing, whack-a-mole. There's so many variables that could come up that we can't predict. I don't think the future's ever been less predictable in many ways. But so those of us though who are interested in building, and that's what you and Simone are, you're builders, and that's what we are. That's what our nonprofit is about. Let's like pivot to that. Like what in this in a world that is somewhat unpredictable, and yet we know that this is something we can predict. Fertility rates and demographic collapse, something we can predict. What are you doing to what are you building to to live in this new world, to protect yourself from, some, I guess, what's coming.
We're building an alliance of different cultures, religions that would like to exist in the future with cultural sovereignty. Um, what Malcolm just described was an intense pressure from mainstream society and from governments to essentially forcibly take and convert children, either in a really forceful way or just through like, oh, well, you're not allowed to do private school. You have to go to public school. And that's where you're going to, sort of lose your culture and become more like the rest of us and, stop acting like a savage. And we are building an alliance of groups who would like to go a different way, who would like to keep their family culture, who would like to educate their own kids, who would like to create their own lifestyles and households and eventually parallel economies. We don't have to agree on values, but we may share resources, including things like dating markets. Because one
Yeah.
thing that a lot of different cultural groups are struggling with, even ones that are pretty vibrant, is they're just running out of eligible bachelors and bachelorettes. They're struggling to find good marriages and matches. And quite honestly, if our children leave our culture, our hope is that they don't go to the urban monoculture as their default. We hope that they go to another hard culture. And I would add, in terms of like, how are religions faring in terms of birth rates? Yeah, most mainstream religions are faring pretty poorly, but there are hard facets within those religions where they have great birth rates, where they have much better mental health. And a lot of that's because many mainstream religions are going what we would call soft. And this is a term that Malcolm uses in a very organized fashion in The Pragmatist Guide to Crafting Religion, one of his books, which is about cultural sovereignty and pronatalism, where he describes hard cultures as cultures where you really have to make sacrifices. You're somewhat othered. Like it's hard to be in that religion, but that religion also provides you with a lot of strength and community and basically both evolutionary and lifestyle advantages. Whereas soft religions are ones who are like, oh, it's okay. Like everyone goes to heaven. You don't have to fast on this day. You don't have to go to church all the time. It's fine. You don't have to dress funny or modestly or whatever. And that's what's going on with most mainstream religions. So it really what this involves is becoming more and more part of the urban monoculture,
Yeah.
which is indistinguishable, from a religion, really. So that's when birth rates start to plummet, and that's also where mental health starts to degrade. That's where all sorts of bad things begin to happen.
And she talks about the tools that we're building. One of the big projects we have right now is trying to build an education system, which, you know, mercifully, it won't be hard to build one that outcompetes the public school system, but that is also cheaper and that doesn't try to brainwash your kids. And that's what the Collins Institute project is, which is likely going to launch in Q1 this year or Q2 this year.
Excellent.
But I would also state that we often talk about pronatalism as the two enemies of pronatalism. So when she's saying, we're trying to build this alliance network, the really positive thing about pronatalism is, when I was in Korea and thinking like, how are they going to maintain this infrastructure when 6% of the existing population is here? How are they going to what are they going to do? Right? Like when everybody disappears, are they going to import people? And it's like, well, they can't import them from China because they have a really low fertility rate. They can't import them from Japan because they have a really low fertility rate. It got me thinking, 100 years ago, less than 100 years ago, Japan was able to motivate a huge portion of its population to go out and murder hundreds of thousands of people to spread their culture. But they seem to be unable to motivate them to have kids. To spread their culture, to keep their culture alive. And it's because the entire game of the system has changed. It used to be the countries that were good at being imperious and that could project their population on other people that would grow and thrive. Whereas now it's the people who can love better, the people, because, Simone and I, we have just 8 kids and those kids have 8 kids. And we do that for just 11 generations. That's more descendants than live on Earth today. It's not the pronatalist families are going to dominate the future of the world, right? We win at the end of the day, at least vis-a-vis the powers that be right now. And this is where the two enemies of pronatalism come from. Enemy one is the urban monoculture, this group that is dominating most media and most governing institutions today, most of academia today, and that can only survive by preying on our children. But that group is going to die out, and we can already see it's largely in its death throes right now. And it's honestly pretty ineffective. It's not that much of a threat. It's a sad little bloated dying corpse, right? The second enemy of pronatalism is, if you remember earlier, I said that dominant cultural strategy today is uh, lowering the economic effectiveness of your members, disengaging with technology, and engaging in high levels of xenophobia. Well, these populations, and they exist across religions. Yes, there's Muslims who fall into this camp, but there's Christians who fall into this camp, and there's Buddhists who fall into this camp. They exist around the world because it's just a really successful strategy right now. Well, they're going to be a much bigger player in the future. And what the pronatalist movement is it's an alliance of all of the different cultural groups that are okay with people other than them existing in the world and that want to work together to preserve that right, whatever that desire comes from for them, against these xenophobic, technophobic. I mean, I can only equate it like if I'm playing Civilization barbarians, right? Who will constantly be attempting to kill us. Essentially, somebody was like, I was explaining this earlier today. They go, so basically the lifestyle of most people you think in 100 years is going to be equivalent to the lifestyle of someone in Israel today. I was like, yes. Whether you are in the United States or in Mexico or in Russia, we will have population groups on our borders that want to kill us.
Well, going back to the technophilic sort of approach, what do you think of Abology and the network state and some of these types of groups' attempts to build? Aren't they building something down in Guatemala or something?
Yeah, we work a lot with charter cities. We're partnered with Praxis, which is one of the charter cities. We've looked
Right.
at raising funding to do one in the Isle of Man. I think that the future, a lot of the future successful economic centers of humanity are going to be charter cities. And it's something that we focus a lot on. But actually, Bology and the network state concept is almost antagonistic or completely antithetical to a charter city. A charter city is saying the future is small, economically and politically independent regions where like-minded people conglomerate. The charter city, the network state idea is that like-minded people don't need to conglomerate anymore in the age of the internet because they can exist in sort of online tribes that have a geographically dispersed footprint. This assumes that the future world has the same level of safety, communication, access to reliable power as the current world, and I don't see that as likely.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, let's talk about some of the things you're building because first of all, your books are beautiful, and I recommend that anybody's really interested in thinking about how to build a new future, and not feel like stuck. The one that we're living in right now, the one that we think is going to happen, it doesn't have to be this way. There's so many opportunities to rethink how we approach the future. And so that's why I really love your work. And
Mhm.
so a couple of areas that would love to go back to the education thing, but also the dating thing, because this is something Aaron and I talk quite a bit about. It seems like to a certain extent, women's gender equality has to some extent come at the expense of male
Their status,
status.
You
Yeah.
take this one, Simone.
And so it's hard to find marriable men.
Yeah.
I have a 40-year-old son. He is not interested in getting married. I adore my son. He's just, yeah, I don't know what I did wrong. So I'm teasing him a little bit because I ask for grandchildren all the time, but this is fairly common. A lot of women my age, our kids are not reproducing, and the girls can't find marriable guys, and the guys are like, well, maybe, what's going on, and what are you thinking about in terms of dating and helping with this bottleneck, which is marriage, right, and dyad agreements and contracts and all these different things that sort of are the bottleneck to get to children.
Right. Yeah. So we see that too. We've seen some really articulate arguments that, a solution to this could be essentially to sort of systematically um disempower women a little bit or like
Mhm.
and sort of affirmative action men in a way where this would enable them to in society regain on average higher status positions, which right now women are more likely to fill those, and due to the growth of bureaucracy, due to affirmative action, due to all sorts of originally well-intentioned policies that were supposed to help increase gender equality.
Simone, just a quick
That is,
assumption that you're making here that the audience may not know. Women typically do better within large bureaucracies than men. So
yeah.
any system that has growing bureaucracies is going to intrinsically power women, even if it isn't doing so through affirmative action in addition to that. Continue.
And this even includes school. Women
Mhm.
just do better in what we call industrial school, which we think is entirely ridiculous and not a good way to teach people anyway.
Yeah,
That's a whole different conversation.
yeah.
We'll
But
get
our
there.
solution is different. It's actually just get people to marry younger, get people really focused on marriage, and have people build their careers together. I think that's one of the big problems is that by the time people are ready to get married, they're struggling to find women are struggling to find men of like higher social class than them, especially when they're in their like mid 30s or 40s. And, men are dealing with women who've completely, and both sides have completely unrealistic expectations by that point. It's not all about social class. And I think the really big problem is that people used to get married as they were starting their adult lives, and then they would build their adult lives together. They would get educated together, they would get jobs together, or they would collectively kind of work around a job.
Mhm.
Um, we think the nuclear family is kind of a really weird aberration that doesn't represent reality. It sort of appeared in the 1900s, but it was never really anything that sustainable. And we think that the more realistic vision for any family that is truly sustainable is what we call, and historians have called, a corporate family, which is typically a husband, wife, children, and even extended family and some staff, working together on a business, which of course historically was maybe a brewery, a bakery, a tannery, and something agricultural, etc. And this was a very very doable format. This house that we live in was built in 1790. We have a picture of the family that used to live here, like 8 or 10 generations or something. They were called the Castleberries, and you can see their aunts, their uncles, like they're holding babies. Like there's this it would seem really odd to us now, or it would seem like very Latin American, I guess, because
Right.
you're more likely to see these extended family units working together and supporting each other in Latin America. And Yet, that's really what we think we should be going for. And even in the 1950s, when you go back and watch the amazing like cornet films, like little instructional videos that they used to show to high schoolers, the standard was you would, graduate high school, get married, and then figure out your life with someone. And that's more what we're encouraging. So
Well,
go ahead, Malcolm.
there's
I'm
been a
sorry.
lot of consequences of the way that we have restructured the dating market in this world of, you're talking about getting married young, but an implication there is you're getting married without a lot of sexual experience. Um, and a consequence of this that a lot of people just didn't think about, but is just obviously true as well, is that women are disproportionately valued on the sexual marketplace when contrasted with the marriage marketplace. What I
Mm.
mean by that is a woman who is going to a bar and looking to get a guy to sleep with them can get a much higher quality in terms of income, in terms of social status, and in terms of attractiveness man to no strings attached sleep with them or have a loose relationship with them than they can get to marry them. But we don't have good social systems for explaining to women that they should not be looking for in a husband someone equivalent to the highest quality man they have ever gotten to sleep with them. And this leads to women undervaluing, not realizing that the men that they are securing as husbands are literally the best they can do. And if anything, might be making sacrifices to be with them because they think they can do better because they have gotten better to sleep with them. And this has been a consequence of these loosening sexual values. I'm not saying it's a negative thing that the sexual values loosened. I'm saying it's a negative thing that they loosened without new systems for teaching people these what should have been obvious lessons. If you like sit back and think about it, but people don't often sit back and think about these things. So you've got a lot of women out there who are hugely overvaluing themselves on the market, and it leads to them treating men really poorly or using men in ways that makes men, because the court systems enormously favor women and everything like that. And so within our existing system, a lot of men feel like, well, if I get married, I'm just gonna get, I'm gonna have to support this person for the rest of my life or something like that. And they don't even appreciate me as much as they should. So when we began to break these historic systems, the new systems that we put in their places were just garbage in terms of like motivating like successful marriages. Now, what's fortunate is that I think it is possible to rebuild successful systems that work within the existing social and technological context, and they do, allow women more choice and more appreciation than they were given in a historic context. But the mainstream one, the one the urban monoculture is using, is obviously not working.
But
Yeah,
so one thing we've discussed doing is literally bringing back a modern version of the London season, which just for audience members who aren't familiar with this was sort of it saw its height in the late 1700s, early 1800s in England, and it took place during the it took place when Parliament was in session in the UK. So you had this problem among landed. Sorry, I keep coughing. You had this problem among landed gentry in the UK where they wanted their kids to meet and intermarry and hang out, but they were all very busy on their big estates and they were all pretty like geographically distributed. It was very hard for them to be meeting all the time. So when the men of the households were in London during the parliamentary season, this was from like, around January, February through like late spring, early summer. They would just bring their whole families to London, and young women of age would make their debut to the Queen or King at the time. This sort of later became the debutante ball. It sort of meant, okay, now I am eligible to be, to be married and I'm looking for a husband. Even their hairstyles would change. So they would start wearing their hair up. So you could kind of tell like, okay, she's on the market. They were like visual signifiers. And they would show up at the various parties that were hosted throughout the London season because all the fine families in London would host parties where these young people would go and meet partners. And sometimes, it would take 1 or 2 seasons to meet someone. Sometimes you'd meet someone the first season and you'd get married at the end of it. But this was a very useful social technology in that it was obviously like very intentional everyone showing up at these parties knew they were showing up to look for a spouse. And there was, a lot of sort of pomp and circumstance around like, okay, this person is, you're going through this ceremony. You have to present yourself to the queen and you have to wear a big train to do it. And then you have to back up with a giant train and not trip. And, then wear your hair differently and then go to these parties. And so, really those in it as well were sort of forced to go through a bunch of subconscious exercises saying, this is a big deal and I'm looking for a husband, which also never happens with the dating app. A dating app, it's like, well, you just like choose a username, put a photo of you up and now you're swiping, like you're off. You don't think about the gravity or consequences of what you're doing.
I think a better way to
Right.
think about this is switching costs. With a
Yeah.
dating app, there's very low switching costs.
Sure.
Yes.
I.e., if I'm dating somebody and I want to date somebody else, this does not negatively impact my reputation or my ability to get another partner. Within something like a London season, which we would likely do as like a long weekend that changes location every year where people can go who are interested in marrying someone and go to a series of parties together. You incur a pretty significant negative social cost is if you start dating someone and then break up with them, or
Sure.
Yeah.
you are sleeping with someone, or you
Well,
show
because
that.
everyone knows who is with who.
Mhm.
And another thing
And
that I think is discounted and which we haven't emphasized publicly enough, but this definitely was a big factor back then too, was the role that parents played in this. In Jane Austen's novels, she has lines where parents complain to each other about like, oh, like this is a lot of work. Like I wish I didn't have to do this, but we'll go out anyway. And then they bravely, went to all the social events and like they didn't want to do that. But they
Right.
invested in it. They made their kids go because they wanted to make sure. And then they would follow up with prospective partners. They did a lot of the engineering in the back end. And that's not something also like there are stories where like, certain characters who had daughters and then just sort of outsourced that to like a sister, an aunt was supposed to do it. It didn't work
Right.
out because there wasn't enough investment. So I think this also demonstrates how much this is a whole family thing. And when we've spoken with other pronatalists, like self-identified pronatalists at pronatalist conferences and meetups and stuff about this issue, one subject that does come up a lot too isn't just like, oh yeah, we do need something like a London season again. We need to bring together single people who want to get married and are really serious about this. But also, we need to bring the family back into this. We need to bring back in family approval. We need to bring back family criticism. And it sort of became apparent in many conversations how that's sort of become an unspoken social taboo. Like you're not supposed to criticize, your son's girlfriend and like make fun of her or
Right.
anything. And you totally should, but you should also be proactively, looking for matches. And when you look at this happening in mainstream culture, a parent trying to set up a kid with a partner, it is almost universally framed negatively. You're
Sure.
like, oh, mom, and although always the partner is like some terrible person, but that's honestly not usually how it works. Usually they're culturally aligned. They're a pretty good,
I mean,
just like they're pretty decent
statistic,
looking.
arranged
Parents,
marriages have equal rates of love in them 10 years after marriage to
there you
non-arranged
go.
marriages. However, when you account for survivorship bias because they have much lower divorce rates, that means that your parents are better at judging who you are going to love in 10 years than you are.
Yeah.
And
Very interesting.
this is something that is just like not okay for mainstream, the urban monoculture to say. You explain this to them and they're like, but that's somebody else telling me what somebody with more experience telling me what I should be doing. That's abuse.
Right.
And it's because we have these really toxic ideas around, and we point this out. I mean, one of the things that I think has caused a lot of harm in our society is the growth of the psychiatry movement. And the psychiatry movement moving away
Yeah.
from traditional psychiatry, which was aimed at, helping people, to a movement that's designed to both build dependency on the psychiatrist while separating people from their support networks. And by that, what I mean is all cults, historically, all cults did this. Cults, the first thing a cult needs to do is to separate you from your support network. And so for most people, that means you need to separate them from their parents and you need to separate them from their birth culture. And the way that the movement has learned, subconsciously, there's no malevolence here. It's just the iterations that did this outcompeted the ones that didn't. Was that if you tell somebody that they have trauma and they can only get rid of their trauma by coming to see you, dependency, and that trauma was caused either by their birth culture putting rules on them, telling them there were things they weren't allowed to do, or their parents, you can do a very good job of building dependency on yourself. And so this has really permeated society and has created a society. One of the episodes we did recently, people used to like their parents, genuinely like their parents. Not liking your parents is not, I mean, yes, I do think the quality of parents declined to some extent over time. But I think the much bigger thing when we look at it isn't a decline in parental quality. It's that society now has built systems that psychologically reward people for an animosity towards either their parents or their birth circumstances. So this is also, on the right, lifted by this rags to riches narratives, which is you can only have a rags to riches narratives if you came from rags. So, even if you didn't come from rags, you need to create this narrative that your childhood was actually really hard, even if it wasn't, which could build animosity between you and your birth culture and your parents.
Right.
Yeah, Erin can speak more about that. But I want to go back to the London season thing because it's so interesting. In a way that really does need to start with maybe rituals. We live in a culture that is so deconstructed, this postmodernist period here. And when a woman becomes a woman, when a girl becomes a woman, and starts her menses, we have no rituals around that.
No.
And that's when you need to start maybe preparing a young woman for the London season, so to speak, or for a young boy becoming a man, for
Totally.
some sort of a ritual. We've just completely, that's all gone. And it seems like it has to start young. And that's why we're really interested in working with young people and maybe even, reimagining home economics and teaching mating dynamics, teaching, sort of self-authoring principles like from the Bildung movement, from the Scandinavian movement, all these different things, bringing them together to help our young people really start thinking about, okay, I am going to have to mate at some point, and I'm really valuable. These are what I can expect to maybe achieve in terms of another mate. Being realistic about what you have to offer, being realistic about what you can achieve in another mate. And I think, are you in your education model? Is that something that you address? Do you think about home economics
Oh, it's
or
totally.
mating
Yeah,
dynamics?
we put
and
it
that
in
sort of thing?
the massive skill tree that Malcolm put together, which is incredibly all encompassing. It
Great.
also includes home economics all the way down to like maintaining and cleaning furniture without doing damage to it, etc. Like it goes deep. But one thing that's inspired me since I was pretty little, and I can share my YouTube playlist list because I just put this together. I just like rewatching it all the time.
Yes.
Is I don't know if you've seen these old 1940s to like 1960s instructional videos on like how to date, basic etiquette, how to groom yourself. And like these things were there. And what I love about it is that, it really isn't obvious to everyone. And there was a time apparently where at least some schools that were playing these videos that would tell you the basics of like how to be a decent friend, how to budget. They understood that not every family is going to teach that or teach it in a very memorable way. And so let's make a little vignette about it that's slightly dramatized and really cute. And I love these. And I mean, we're definitely going to link to them from our skill tree. Although there's many, many, many sources that we're linking to from there. And obviously, when it comes to cleaning, we have a lot of additional stuff today we can use, which is great. But yeah, I mean, home ec is huge, and it's not just that. I mean, there in my high school was an old auto shop, like all like lifters and everything for fixing cars, and it just sat empty. And it was just so sad to me that like we had home ec kitchens, we had an auto body shop, no one was allowed to use any of it.
Yeah.
Second wave, we all have to go to college, right?
Yeah, well, yeah,
it's become a
we're gonna pay
pipeline.
someone else to do that for us.
Right.
So no
Yes.
problem.
Well, and STEM, became much more dominant in schools, and life skills and physical education, and that, really in the 80s just took a huge downturn when my son was, born. And what about, can we talk about dyad agreements? Do you think that the marriage contract is out of date? Do you think that we need to come up with new dyad agreements in terms of, especially economics?
Like the societal default.
Yeah, like for instance, okay, we're going to get married and we're going to have, and maybe it's not until death do us part. I don't know. Maybe it's until we agree to get the kids to a certain age, for instance. Like if we're going to have children, that no matter what, we are going to make sure that this child gets to a certain age together. That while I'm really vulnerable and taking care of an infant, you commit to support and protect me no matter what. Just like very specific sort of agreements spelled out. Because I know when I got married young, I had no idea what I was doing. None. Like this just wasn't in my consciousness. Again, this was back in the early '80s, but I just wonder if young people really, if they could connect with a real dyad agreement that they could that felt real to them, other than until death do us part.
Oh,
So
yeah.
one of the things we're controversially known for is in the Pragmatist Guide to Relationships, we offer a free marriage contract that you can download. And
You do?
we were actually interviewed for
Oh,
this on another station recently.
oh,
They're like, "What, marriage contracts?" And then somebody tried it, and they're like, "Oh, this is actually really useful." That just goes over because it used to be as a society, and then people are like, a marriage contract. A marriage is a contract. Yeah, and the
mhm.
contract terms are different depending on where you're getting married. If I get married in a Catholic household versus in a Muslim household, you know, those are different terms. With a Muslim household, I might be able to marry additional women. Like that's
Right,
very different terms.
right.
And if you get married in a progressive versus non-progressive household, and people just assume that all of these are standardized, and they're not.
Mhm.
And because we live in such a multicultural and changing cultural environment today, the shrewdest way to approach a marriage is to say, okay, well, what I'm going to do is I'm going to ensure that we are on the same page with the contract that we have. And that means
Mhm.
just going over every potential point of disagreement before the marriage happens. And this isn't saying that you have to live by the contract you create, but it's about ensuring that your expectations for the marriage are aligned. In the interview earlier today, somebody was like, "But doesn't that take all the fun out of the marriage? All the little things you learn about your partner in terms of like the different expectations you had for this relationship?" I'm like, "Oh, a marriage isn't a Kinder egg. You if you screw this up, you screw up your kids, and you probably screw up your finances, and you screw
Mhm.
up a huge chunk of the small time we have on earth. Don't mess around with this. Find out, for example, okay, if your spouse's parents run out of money and they say, 'Can we live with you?' What's the response supposed to be? Because that's something that you should have probably agreed
Mm.
on before you got married. At the very least, you should agree on a number of children, conventions for how you're going to name those children, conventions for how you're going to punish those children, what holidays you're going to do with them. This is stuff you cannot negotiate on the fly. And I think a lot of people who don't make these talks beforehand, don't agree on this stuff beforehand. The reason they're not agreeing on it is because they know that they disagree on this, and they think that it'll be, I guess, better if they just wait until the problem comes to a head, which it won't be. It'll
Yeah,
be
I'm constantly
infinitely worse.
shocked by how many people enter into marriage before discussing their values in terms of children. I mean,
Yeah.
Right?
my husband and I got married this summer, and we
Congrats.
decided to get married. Thank you. We decided to get married because we were ready to have children with one another.
Mm.
Like our marriage is based on a commitment to raise a family together. And it just the number of people I know or have come across on social media who they end up breaking up because they have discovered that somebody wanted 5 kids and the other wanted no more than 4 or was never planning to get them pregnant in the first place is just it's incredible. So I think, the fact that you have a marriage contract, a template included in a pragmatist guide is beautiful. And I always, having gone through my husband and I went through Catholic marriage preparation. And I came out of that experience really valuing the union and wishing that there was a secular iteration of that so that everybody, has this foundation upon which to build a healthy, sustainable relationship.
And
Yeah, well, we
Catholic
think
marriage preparation is just so obviously a good idea.
It's
even if you go
great.
through like the Catholic or any like religious version, I would say like probably like Jewish marriage, like like rules or stipulations are probably the most detailed and strict when I come
Mhm.
to think of it. Like they're just like, whoa, man, there's a lot here. But even they don't address like what's the agreed upon internal temperature of your home and how do you deal with conflict around that.
Right,
And we
right.
have like an easy solution, which is we have like this is the agreed upon temperature. If so and so wants to pay the like delta of going above that or below that for comfort, then they're the ones paying that difference,
Amazing.
right? And like, well, let's work that out, because these are the dumb things that people end up fighting about and then building grudges around. And most religions don't, they don't address that. So it's just so important to go through all these little stupid things before they become heated, and do it. And it's also like, Malcolm and I found it very fun. We have a Google Doc that we created well before we were engaged, just when we were first dating, where we started outlining these things. And it's obviously something that constantly gets revised. Like we keep adding more kid name candidates to it. But we also add other things, other new adjustments, things that hadn't occurred to us. And going through and seeing the changes, I mean, it just reminds us of our commitment to each other and all these fun things that we've worked out. And I think a lot of the things that people are afraid are going to be deal breakers is if they're discussed ahead of time in a very neutral context. It's amazing, like how quickly you can overcome them. Like, oh no, I draw the line here. I'm never going to do X. And it's like, well, but what if you never had to pay for X? Oh, sure. Well, then I would do X forever. So okay, like let's find where the point of leverage is. Or let's find who cares more about this, and maybe we can trade this. Like you get to name all the kids, and I get to decide whether they get to like go to sports camp or something. I don't know, whatever it is.
Sure.
So it's really fun.
And better to go through that process, before you're 28, 34, whatever the case may be. And then you have to re-enter the dating market.
Yeah.
And your value is dropping over time. Right. And so, something I mentioned to my youngest sister is 18 years old. So I tell her, like, there's something to getting the MRS degree. If you're going to pursue college, this is the best time to find someone that is worth, spending your whole life with. It doesn't get any easier on the other side. And I think, it's a product of this careerist mentality. So where I want to go with this question is kind of back to what you think about the corporate family and people building a life together, what you kind of are envisioning that corporate family looks like in a modern context. But I think, what I hear from that is that we have to, what we're talking about, that 16-year-old is shifting a mindset to, hey, you ought to be thinking now as your star is rising in terms of your mate value. How are you going to utilize that? And, you could spend your time switching from guy to guy, or you could make an investment in yourself by virtue of looking for, someone who is really going to be able to build a life with you. And that life within college is going to look as much as you desire it to be, right? You're not going to have to make as many sacrifices to what you want to pursue if you're looking for that person in your college years, 18 to 22. Yeah. So what is your vision for like what the corporate family looks like, into this future?
Well, I mean, the core way, the corporate family is one solution. There are other solutions to this. We talk about the corporate family. We talk about the shield and sword family. These are two different models that I think are both pretty viable in today's world. So corporate family is you all work together on the same projects. That's what Simone and I do. Simone and I are co-CEOs of our company. My brother does this the same way. He's co-CEOs of a company with his wife. We co-write our books together. We co-run our podcast together. That's the corporate family. Then your kids engage with that. Shield and sword families, I think, are also a very viable model. Shield and sword means that it's one of the couple's roles to have a stable income, and then it's the other partner's role to have a high risk, high reward income. Very similar to like Viking families back in the day, where the wife would be in charge of making sure the farm continued to grow crops, managing the animals, the livestock, the farm, and the husband would go out Viking or raiding, and then hopefully come back and bring a lot of treasure. But it was high risk, high reward. And you can do this, regardless of how you switch up gender. So there's a lot of different ways that you can structure things that don't align with the current, I would say, feminist model or even old model. I would say what is unrealistic for most people these days is a wife not working and a husband being the sole income earner. That was never really realistic. That was an idea that was popularized, as Simone pointed out, by 1950s Hollywood. They didn't care anything more about portraying the truth than today's Hollywood. It had an agenda to push, and that agenda was not in line with what was realistic for most Americans. And so a lot of people who are chasing that they are chasing something that was never traditional, never realistic at a large scale. And that I think it's pretty toxic. What I do think is not toxic is you telling your sister find a husband in college. I think if you realistically, for people who haven't gone through college yet or are in college right now, if you can't find a person in college, uh, it gets really harder afterwards. Like college is easy mode. And I would say that for my kids, I would say as important as graduating and as much of a failure of graduating college without somebody who you're going to marry is graduating college without a degree. Like that, those are equally important things to do in college. And if you don't do it in college, then you absolutely have to do it in grad school because you are dealing with a large pool of pre-vetted candidates who are similar socioeconomic status to you, which is actually really important in a marriage. If you look at the statistics, similar education level, actually really important when you're looking at the statistics. And it is normalized to be dating and finding a partner. If you don't have a partner by the time you graduate, you're basically an old man maid in our society. And if you're like, well, no, I can go out, where are you going to find people? A fucking bar? Like, where? No, realistically, oh, on Tinder, have you looked at the statistics of those relationships? No, you really do need to take college as a very serious mating market opportunity.
Right. Yeah. Unless you're going back to church.
And where else
Yeah.
can
Yeah.
people who maybe are maybe opting out of college and looking towards non-traditional ways of getting their education? Where can those young people meet? Do you think these days?
These days, it's mostly church. Like Aaron pointed out.
Yeah, it's almost
Just
like we
aren't
need
a
to
lot of
create
options
a
anymore.
new another place for them to meet. I don't know what the answer is. And the other thing that I think about is the emotional maturity of young people. We're seeing adolescence, extended well into the late 20s. And, is an 18-year-old even emotionally self-aware or mature enough to pick another mate or to pick a mate? So I don't know. These are, again, this comes back to education models where we're really teaching emotional maturity and self-authoring uh, and sovereignty in terms of individual. And it feels, Mary Harrington talks quite a bit about this atomization of culture and of the individual and helping this is all great, right?
These things can be imparted to people earlier. And I'm so glad that you're working to do that. And that's also why I'm so obsessed with those like 1950s instructional videos, because they also basically set the standard. They said, listen, you're a teen, you need to become emotionally mature. Benjamin Franklin is 12 years old and working and, acting basically like an adult. We're capable of it. I think a lot of it is just setting cultural standards. That said, there are, I think, many examples of people who still went through mainstream societal upbringings and found really good spouses in college and grew up together. Malcolm's brother and our sister-in-law met like maybe the first week of college, undergrad,
First day
right,
of
Malcolm?
college, yeah.
Yeah, so they met very, like relatively, like for our society standards, very young. And the only reason they didn't get married while they were still in college was sort of like, weird financial aid issues and like, they just had to wait. But they very much, they were super young, but they grew up together and they have matured amazingly. And like Malcolm said, they work together and they're like very high powered investors and entrepreneurs. So I think you don't have to be incredibly emotionally mature, that you do have to be very dedicated to each other. And they were,
A
but
lot of
like,
this is, I also think, expectations around the way you structure relationships and the way you structure your life.
yeah.
We are taught a lot of toxic things in our society today, even in the degraded religious traditions that we live in today. For example, like a really toxic thing in a marriage is people who believe, as the urban monoculture would tell them, that an emotion is justification for an action, i.e., I did this because I was angry. When historically, we would have obviously told you, stop being angry then, you idiot. I did this because I was jealous. Well, then that's your failure for being jealous. Like, over it, you know? And I think that a lot of people hear that and they're like, I don't know, that's hard. And this then comes to the idea of traditionalist cultures, which we push on our own podcast, Base Camp, in some ways, and the diversity of traditionalist cultures versus the urban monoculture. And the urban monoculture says you don't need to make any sacrifices. Your emotions are always justification for action. If something is offensive to you, then that is justification for you doing whatever you want to that person. If something in any way causes a negative reaction in you, then you get to react however you want. You have what would be called in the field of psychology, a psychological license to do whatever you want.
Yeah.
And that's just obviously toxic and stupid, but it's also obviously toxic and stupid if you're a young person. It's like, well, why can't I do this? Why can't I just do whatever I feel like doing whenever I feel like doing it? Whether it's having, sex with whoever I want, or whether it's emotionally reacting however I'm feeling in the moment. And it's, well, if you want to see why we have these rules, you can look at the statistics around happiness rates around far progressive. You can look at the statistics around rates of mental health issues around far progressives. They are off the charts in both instances in the negative. And it turns out that just doing whatever you want, whenever you feel like doing it, actually has a lot of negative consequences. And all of these little rules your parents raised you with, if you had the fortune of being raised in any simulacrum of an ancestral culture, had a reason behind them. The problem is that the society, the powers at play in our society, the urban monoculture that controls everything, they have every reason to hide this from you, because this is what they're using to convert you and to bring you over. And so I think a lot of this is to some extent on parents to understand that the forces arrayed against them in society today are not the forces that were arrayed against them when they were growing up. And they really need to build better systems. They really need to think, when they're banning something for their kids, is this actually something that needs to be banned? Like, a lot of people are just operating on these old cultural systems, which are bleeding members like crazy. And we need to be aware. What are the tools that the urban monoculture is using to recruit our kids? How can we prep those kids to face those tools in the same way that we growing up had to be prepped to face people offering us drugs and meth and stuff like that? And how can we ensure that we are not putting additional temptations in front of our kids that are completely unnecessary temptations? Here's an example here. You mentioned Mary Harrington. We were at ARC recently and they did something on porn. Like, porn should be made illegal and no one should be. And I was like, if you raise your kid believing that, you are absolutely and it's a male child, you're going to lose that kid. 98% probability you're going to lose that kid, because that's just unrealistic. Of course they're going to find porn. Of course they're going to use porn. And then of course they're going to be like, well, then if I've done this and I haven't faced negative consequences, and all those other rules my parents gave me are probably not worth obeying. Because these rules developed in an environment where, through pushing these rules, we were able to motivate our kids to have more offspring, because people who didn't engage in these sorts of behaviors had more, conjugal sex with their wife and had more kids. And so that led to growth of those iterations of that culture over other iterations of that culture. But in today's environment, it's incredibly toxic. It's not even politically useful, as I pointed out to them. I was like, the left completely ceded male sexuality. You look at the controversies around sexy women in media, and it's the conservatives who are pushing for this. Whereas the left is saying, well, women in media need to be desexualized. What does it mean to desexualize a woman while also increasing the number of women in media? It means, well, they can't have boobs. They can't have butts. They can't have any. It's so what do they look like then? They look like underage women. They look like women who haven't gone through puberty. Is it any surprise that we see a rate in these sorts of deviant sexualities among the people in power in our society, when the dominant power players have been pushing this narrative, I think, without thinking about the consequences of all of their individual actions for decades at this point.
Right. Well, we're coming close to the end of our time together.
I gotta get my wife to sleep. She's got pneumonia.
Yeah. and so I guess maybe just as on a closing, I don't know if we should ask for advice for parents or for
We should.
Beth.
That was going to be my
or
selfish
for
question.
Beth, your sister.
Yeah.
18-year-old, you've got an 18-year-old daughter. How do you best advise her in this cultural moment? And what would you tell her if you did have an 18-year-old daughter right now? What would you tell her should be her very next steps? I mean, we've talked about mating and all of these things, but if we could just finish a little bit, go a little bit more into that, and then we'll wrap it up and get you back in bed.
Back to bed.
Simone.
Thank you. I mean, I'm setting our daughters directly to Malcolm's books, The Pragmatist Guide to Relationship and The Pragmatist Guide to Sexuality. The reason why is our big belief, and this touches on what Malcolm was saying about erotic material exposure, is that we strongly, strongly believe that if you want to keep your children within your culture, it is not about sheltering, it is about giving context. You show it to them. They have access, but you give them context. And we want everyone in our family to understand, like, here's how human sexuality works. And we went way further than where the mainstream research goes, which is surprisingly myopic and also extremely male-centric, it turns out. And we want our daughters to be open-eyed. So we're not going to be like, well, never, have sex before marriage. That would be terrible. You should never, never do that. But we're going to say, listen, if you do that, here are the costs. And they're real costs. But, depending on what you want to do with your life, depending on the trade-offs that you really want to make, here are some strategies to keep in mind. And that's, we want them to go in with all the tools so that they can make their own decision. Because who are we to say that we are going to make the best decision on their behalf? And certainly, who are we to make a decision that they may comply with? So that's
I think it's about raising
primarily
them
what we
within a
advise.
culture where, they know that we know that, yeah, finding a long-term partner is harder for them than it was for our generation or than it was for the generation before us. But their lives are also dramatically easier than their ancestors 3 or 4 generations ago, which isn't, I think, properly emphasized to people enough
Right.
today because they
Not
don't
at all.
read these old books. They don't really take in mind like how actually hard life used to be. And so when they hear that things are harder than what their parents went through, a lot of their reaction is, well, then I guess I shouldn't try. And it's like, no, it means that today you need to arm yourself. You need to be like an elegant dancer moving through this storm of blades that is coming at you every day of challenges that people didn't need to face before. You can't just go back to the old ways. You need to prepare yourself with sanity and pragmatism and plan every stage of the dance out beforehand. Be very intentional and be very persistent because the reward is a reward that no one historically has had, which today, if you are one of these small groups of economically productive individuals who are having kids, you control the future of our species. You are part of a very small portion of our species that is going to be the iteration of our species that takes to the stars, that takes over most of the governments in the future, and that ends up shaping what it means to be human. You will be rewarded for undertaking this unique challenge of our generation, but understand it's a challenge and understanding that every generation is to an extent martyrs for the next one.
Well, I think that's a beautiful place to leave it. That's a beautiful message for the young people listening to us today. Thank you both
Oh,
so much.
Oh, thank
one
you.
thing, though, I do want to say to like would-be parents, not like parents of 18-year-olds.
Yeah,
though.
right.
There is nothing harder than having one kid and planning to only have one kid because everything
Yes.
is extra stressful. You're spending way too much time on everything. You're spending way too much money on everything. It is just not sustainable. Nothing scales. Even having one kid with the mindset that you're going to have like 5 or 7 somehow makes it easier because you think like, all right, like I want to react this way to them doing this, but am I going to be able to do this when I have like 6 other kids running around?
Yeah.
Nah. So
Yeah.
like, I'm just going to let it go. And we actually found that was really useful when we had 1 and just 2. It gets easier with each kid. Not only do like realistically and very technically economies of scale kick in after kid number 4. But we found that even after 3 kids, like they really start entertaining each other. And that's even like when like the infant is still on our back. We have a young girl who's like a little bit too young to play with her 2 older brothers, but just watching them like amuses her. Just being able to see them play entertains her. And then they entertain each other and then learn a lot from each other. So I would just say that there's no greater gift you can give to yourself as a parent, or like to your kids, than to have more kids. Obviously, if you want them and if you feel like you can raise them by your standards, but I think part of why it's so helpful to have a lot of kids is because it forces you to be reasonable in your standards and to give kids the kind of life that will not infantilize them, will not turn them into neurotic people who are incapable of doing anything, will help them develop responsibility and maturity early, but in a constructive and happy context. This isn't about deprivation or hardship or mom and dad got hit by a car and they're dead now. It's, like one of my younger siblings got hurt and everyone's really busy right now and maybe I can help them. And,
Right.
feeling that care for someone and taking that responsibility and realizing, oh, wait, I can help other people. I can
Yeah.
be more mature. So I just wanted to add that because it's something that doesn't seem to really occur to people. And whenever we say,
No.
wait, what?
Mhm.
Like, one has to be the easiest. And people also say all the time, oh, like, I have one kid. I could never imagine having more. And we're like, man, I could never imagine having one kid. Too
Yeah.
stressful, too much work.
Yeah.
So
Yeah,
just
I'm a cautionary tale there. I had one and I really regret not having more.
it's
And
hard
I'm
having one. You did the most work.
Yeah, and I'm also of the age where I remember all my grandparents came from families of 8 or 9 or 10 kids,
Mhm.
each one of them.
Mm.
It's just you get to my parents, born in the 40s, late 30s and 40s, it starts to go down, and then my generation, nobody's reproducing at my generation. So it's really interesting,
Yeah.
and those big families, they're so close, and they all took care of each other, and it's I can't agree more. And I listened to
Yeah.
your recently one of your podcasts, talking about the economic realities of that. I mean, it really is interesting how it really isn't that as expensive as one might think.
Yeah. As someone who thought 1 or 2 up until 2 years ago, and now I'm trying to get 1 out a year until I'm,
Ooh.
35, 36. I'm trying to encourage everybody to do the same. So I will echo that sentiment. And then also to one last thing is to mention how many amazing resources that you all offer for parents on pronatalist.org. There's a state by state breakdown. And I am really interested to follow along with the Collins Institute myself. I think there's a lot of parents out there who are wanting to opt out of the urban monoculture, who are shopping education models, especially ones that are less expensive than, 50,000 a year private school or Catholic school or whatever the case may be. So we are huge fans of your work, Simone and Malcolm.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
Thank you
Thank
so
you
you.
again.
much.
Oh,
And
that's
we'll
really
link
thoughtful.
we'll put all your information, of course, in the show notes and all that. But thank you again so much. Really appreciate your
Thank you to
time.
both of you. Yeah, this is really fun.
Yeah.